Hi, and welcome to Unit 6, Part 1, Lecture 1. So this is going to be the beginning. Unit 6 is actually going to be a really long unit. There's 3 different pieces to it. So the first part is about mitosis and meiosis. So this first lecture is cell growth, division, and reproduction. Learning objectives. Describe some of the difficulties a cell faces as it increases in size. Compare asexual and sexual reproduction. Surface area is the amount of area that's covering an object. So if you were to think about a two-dimensional object, that would be like a fence around a yard or around something. You might talk about the surface area in geometry like that. Whereas in a three-dimensional object, we're not just talking about one side, we're also talking about the third side. So we have all of these different pieces coming together. Okay, so that's the outside of this cube. The volume is the space that's inside the cube. So all of this is part of the volume. Whereas the surface area is just talking about the outside covering. Now in this, because it's a three-dimensional object, we have basically 6 sides. So we've got the 3 that you can see, and then there's 3 more that you can't see in this picture because we're trying to represent a three-dimensional object in 2D. So the surface area of a cube has the length, okay, which you could take as any one of these. So the length, okay, the width, so length, width times 6, because there are 6 sides. The volume, and I'll change colors here, is again the length, the width, and then we now add the height. So that's just the length times the width times the height. So these are just 2 formulas. We're not going to do a whole lot with the math. I just want you to be acquainted with it, I guess you could say. So for this cube, 1 times 1 times 6 is 6 centimeters. Okay, and then the volume is 1 times 1 times 1, which is still 1. Okay, so we have a surface area of 6 and a volume of 1. Okay, and you notice centimeters cubed, centimeters squared, and cubed. So cells are 3D cubes. They're not quite cube shaped, but that's the best way we can represent them for our purposes. Here we have a 2 centimeter cube and a 3 centimeter cube. So following the same stuff, okay, the surface area, length times width times 6, is 24 for this guy, and volume is length times width times height. Okay, so the surface area and the volume are calculated, okay, and the surface area and volume are calculated here. So you can see, all right, there's a big difference in volume as the cell grows. So the cell went from just 2 centimeters, okay, to 3 centimeters, and the volume increased an awful lot. So when we look at cells, we're looking at what happens with their surface area and their volume. And so here we've got our 1 centimeter cell, okay, our 2 centimeter cell, and our 3 centimeter cell. And what happened over the course of time is this volume here increased dramatically, okay? And so that increase dramatically creates a surface to volume ratio, which is basically where you just take the surface area and divide it by the volume, or turn it into a ratio. All right, which that's what it is, okay? All right, so we went from 6 to 1 to 2 to 1. Okay, the larger the ratio, the better, because things are trying to get in and out of the cell all the time. Oxygen, carbon dioxide, food, sugar, okay, water, all of these things are trying to get in and out of the cell. The surface area to volume ratio, okay, is really important because the surface area is where things are going to come in contact and be able to go in or out. The volume, however, is how much space it has to travel to get into the cell. Okay, so as we increase that volume, that surface area is going to be increased, or as we increase that volume, the surface area is not going to be able to keep up, and so that's why this ratio is goes down dramatically. So these limitations that are caused by this increase in volume are two things. One, we get an information crisis. Think about your brain when you have to study for a test, okay? Then think about your brain when you have to study for 2 or 3 tests in the same day or week. All right, there's too many demands placed on your brain. Right? The DNA is the brain of the cell. So if we get too big, there are too many demands placed on the brain of the cell. And so what happens is that creates an information crisis. Okay, so there's not enough information, there's not enough materials to go back and forth. The second thing that happens is that there are too many traffic problems. Okay, the volume grows too fast, right? And so what happens is getting in and out of that cell, so being able to get in and out, okay, it becomes a giant mess. There's too many things. Okay, think about traffic at 5 o'clock in the afternoon versus traffic at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So if you leave school at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it's not nearly as crowded as maybe if you leave school after doing something and you're here until 4:30 or 5. Okay, that's, rush hour. All right, so that's what happens in the cell, is that as the cell grows, it ends up basically being in a constant state of rush hour, and that means it can't get anything done. Okay, that's why it takes longer. If you use the Waze app, all right, the Waze app will tell you that, like, if you leave at this time, it'll take you this many minutes to get there. If you leave at this time, it'll take you this many minutes to get there. Okay, because what could happen is in that time, the traffic. So if you think about traffic, all right, that's the cell growing. Okay, so cells divide, all right, division, which means, to divide, all right, enabled to compensate for the information crisis or for the traffic problems. So what happens is it can produce 2 daughter cells, okay, and there's a couple of different ways that this can happen that we're going to talk about. But the first thing that always happens is cells have to replicate their DNA before cell division. Okay, so they're going to replicate their DNA because, remember, this is the brain of the operation. All right, so both cells need a copy of the brain. Okay, and then what dividing does is it actually makes the cell smaller. It's hard to see. Makes the cell smaller, so then it lowers that volume, and then it's able to keep that higher surface area to volume ratio. So ultimately, we're trying to get the volume to go down. Okay, because remember, that's the ability to travel through that 3-dimensional space. That's what that volume is. There are 2 types of reproduction, okay, and both of them rely on cell division. So asexual reproduction is where we end up producing a genetically identical offspring. So here, all right, is a great example of a bacteria cell going through asexual reproduction. All right, it's dividing, okay? So on both sides of that, you see 2 exact same cells, right? Okay, so they basically look identical. A little bit more green on one side than the other, but other than that, they look identical. Okay, so plants and some animals can use it. Asexual reproduction is basically when they will, what's called spawn, or not. I don't want to use the word spawn. It's just where they're basically creating a copy. Okay. All right. So asexual reproduction is creating a copy of that cell. Now, if you're doing it like a bacteria cell, you're creating a whole new organism. So asexual reproduction is to create a new organism. All right. That's what reproduction is for. That's what reproduction is about, creating a new organism. Asexual, it creates an identical version as offspring. Sexual reproduction, however, okay, is going to also create a new organism, but it requires two separate parent cells. All right. Okay, we still create a new organism. Organism, but it requires two separate cells coming together. So usually we talk about the sperm and the egg. Right? Sperm and egg, pollen, ovum, all right, that's all part of sexual reproduction. So offspring, where is that? Okay. Offspring inherit some of the genetic information from each parent. This is why we look similar but not identical. Okay, we look similar but not identical to our parents, brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents, all right, whoever you may be biologically related to. You are going to look and behave similar to some of them but not identical. So sexual reproduction requires two separate parent cells, where asexual reproduction only requires one. So asexual reproduction can produce a lot of offspring in a short period of time. They don't need a mate, okay? This genetic when you're genetically identical, there's no variation. That variation, that means that those organisms may not be able to withstand changes, but in a stable environment, those organisms can flourish. Right? Whereas sexual reproduction generally requires fewer offspring because it takes more time. There needs to be a mate of some sort. Changing environments, that genetic diversity is going to be super beneficial. Variation, okay? Variation is super important to us surviving, okay? Because then what we can do is we can handle any sort of changes that come along, or at least some of us can handle some changes. Why aren't we all sick at the same time? We're not sick at the same time because we have different immune systems. Those different immune systems help us survive as a species. Okay? Now, that means that some offspring may be less well adapted. That happens. Okay? But some offspring will be better adapted. So there's kind of a curve there with sexual reproduction. All right? I'll talk to you. Have a great day. Bye.